Good morning, everyone. We would like to offer a warm welcome to everyone here live in the audience and also to our viewers attending from home by live stream video. So thank you all for your participation and for your joining us here today. We have an incredible lineup today of speakers. Absolutely the best we've ever had. We are starting off with Scott Wolter, followed by William Henry, Dr. Robert Schock, Graham Hancock, John Van Auken, and Giorgio Tsoukalos. And so it's an amazing lineup. And our first speaker, there's occasionally in this role, I worked for 33 years as a geological engineer, mostly outside the United States, and I started doing this in 2007. And occasionally you meet people, and as soon as you meet them, you know them, and you have a really good feeling about them. And meeting Scott Wolter and his lovely wife, Janet, was like that for me. There was just an instant feeling of easiness, and this is a good person. And so it is a real pleasure to introduce our opening speaker, Scott Wolter, the host of the television series America Unearthed. It was a show that I was glued to. I watched every episode. I thought it was fantastic. You're in for a real treat this morning with forensic geologist, author, and just a great person. My pleasure to introduce Scott Wolter.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Scott. And before we get going too far, I would like to introduce my co-researcher and eternal traveler, Janet Wolter. I'm the guy that gets all the attention, but I think most people in this room know who the brains of the outfit is. And it's true, I'm telling you, just look at our transcripts. So anyway, thank you for having me and inviting me here today. I have a really cool story and some information that I'm going to share with you that I'm very passionate about. And what we're going to start with today is we're going to talk about rocks, one rock in particular. And then what we're going to do is eventually move into a little bit more of esoteric material. And tomorrow, I'm going to talk a lot more about symbolism and esoteric aspects of this whole thing. It's complicated, it's vast, and it's important. So I will get started and let you decide. How many people have not heard of the Kensington Runestone? Raise your hand. Okay, there's a fair number. And I have another question. Is Robert Schock here? Robert, you better be here because I put slides in for you, buddy. No, seriously, you know, this research that I'm going to talk about and this experience I've had really begins with the rocks, with this rock. And I have to say that we'll talk a little bit about the controversies that we've dealt with. Robert is no stranger to that. A lot of people in this room are no stranger to controversy, and neither am I. But I have to say that in all the debates and all the arguing and the discussions that happen, I always go back to the rocks because rocks don't care. People care. And so when sometimes I just get so frustrated with the way things are handled, I always go back to the rocks because I trust the rocks. Okay. Well, this is the Kensington Runestone. And it's about 31 inches long, 15.5 inches wide, and 5.5 inches thick. the fall of 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer, you're going to meet in a second, by the name of Olof Oman, was clearing trees in preparation for farming on his roughly 100-acre parcel in Kensington, Minnesota, which is right there, about 15 miles west-southwest of Alexandria, about a 2-hour drive from my house. Unless the grandson of the discoverer is driving Darwin Oman, it's about an hour and a half. When he goes back to the farm, he puts the pedal to the metal. He's a wonderful guy. Standing at this exact spot, probably in about 1927, we're not sure. The guy in the middle is Olof Oman, and they're pointing to the exact spot where the stone was found. Now, the reason I show you this is that I want you to notice it's not at the top of the hill, where many people say it should have been. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This is an artist's recreation of the moment of discovery. Olaf was clearing trees with his 2 oldest sons. His oldest son, Olaf, standing in the background, was 12 years old at the time, and his second oldest son, Edward, was 9, about to turn 10, and he's pointing at the stone symbolically because he was the first one to notice that when they tipped over this 25 to 30-year-old tree, according to the testimony of 12 people who signed written affidavits, that when they cut off the roots around the base of the tree and tipped it over with a winch, the stump came up and tightly wrapped around the stone. The roots were around the stone. It actually pulled it out of the ground, and it was almost directly under the tree, and he was the first one to notice that there was something carved on the stone. At first they thought it was an Indian almanac, but eventually they realized it was carved in Scandinavian runes in the Old Swedish language. Now, these are the first pictures ever taken of the rune stone by an amateur geologist, ironically enough. And what I want to do is point out the inscription, because I'm going to talk at length about the inscription and a new discovery that I made this past year when I was raised as a Freemason. Because I had studied this stone, which you will see led me down what I call the Templar road. And it led me down there because I followed the evidence trail. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But here's what the inscription says, starting on the picture on the left, on the upper left-hand side, or top left of the stone, is actually a number. It's a pentatic number. It's actually Arabic in origin. But it's the number 8. And it says 8 Gotalanders, which is an area in the southern Baltic region of Europe, and 8 Northmen on this acquisition business or taking up land journey far to the from Vinland far to the west. Vinland. That's that place talked about in the Viking sagas, which we believe to be the northeast coast of North America. Interesting that in 1362 they knew where that place was. I guess that shouldn't be a surprise. We had a camp near 2 shelters, 1 day's journey north from this stone. After we came home, we found we were fishing one day. I can't forget that. That's very important. Think about that. We were fishing one day. To me, that seems like a rather trite statement, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. After we came home, we found 10 men red from blood and death. AVM, 3 Latin letters, which of course to many of the Scandinavian scholars was a problem. But it's not a problem at all. I've seen many medieval grave slabs with runes and Latin letters. And then saved from evil on line 9. On the split side it says, there are 10 men by the sea with our ships, 14 days journey from this island, peninsula, hill. And the reason I point that out is because the word in Old Swedish basically means a rise in land, which could be a peninsula, a hill, or an island. But many people have run with the idea that it was an island, and so what they've tried to do geologically is raise the water levels in Kensington in the 14th century, which did not happen. It was actually drier at that time. And the Vikings did not sail into Kensington. They walked. And the year says 1362. And of course, many people have tried to, attach the Vikings to this artifact. This is not the Viking Age. The Viking Age ended at the latest 1066, and Christianity had gone all across Europe into Scandinavia. This is late medieval times. These were not Vikings. They were somebody else. That's a fact. And it's amazing to me how many people are still talking about the Vikings. It's silly. So, this is me 16 years ago, minding my own business, running my materials forensic laboratory that I've now been doing for 31 and a half years. And basically what I do as a forensic geologist is perform autopsies on concrete and rock. Think about that. Does that sound boring? It's not. I've worked on some amazing projects. I've worked on murder cases. Probably the thing that I'll be remembered most for is working on the fire-damaged structural concrete at the Pentagon after 9/11. And that was an amazing story. I got a great lecture on that, but that's for another time. Anyway, I was doing my thing when I received a call from the Runestone Museum, and they said, "We'd like you to study the Kensington Runestone." And I said, "What's that?" I never heard of it. I didn't know what it was, and quite frankly, I didn't really care. I get a lot of interesting projects. And, I mean, this was certainly different, but I just don't have time to fall in love with the work that I do because something's coming tomorrow and I got to giddy up. So they came in and they started telling me about the Runestone and what it was, and I stopped them in mid-sentence. I said, "Hey, let me tell you something right now before we get started. You need to be prepared that when I get done, I may come back and give you news you're not going to like. And you're still going to pay me." It's a beautiful thing because in my business, it doesn't matter what the results are. I get paid either way. Kind of like being a lawyer, right? Anyway, that's the way it is. And they said, "Okay, let's go." So off we went. But I have to say, it's been an incredible journey. And as evidence of that, take a look at that hair. My hair used to be dark. Jeez. And it was because of the stone. Maybe. Okay. Here's some of the geological aspects of the stone that are actually quite interesting. And I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because I want to get to some more of the fun stuff. But this is actually fun stuff to me. One of the first things I noticed were these interesting twin undulating and branching lineations, white lineations on the back of the stone. They kind of look like a root pattern to me. Now, the 12 witnesses that saw the stone, the tree, and the roots the day and in the days after the discovery said that the roots going over the back of the stone were 3.5 inches wide and flattened from prolonged contact. Now, this is at odds with this because we have only a maximum of 1/2 inch wide on these white, what looks like root leaching to me. This is a problem. Now, in forensic science, what we're trying to do is gather data, evidence. And you cannot reach a conclusion until all the evidence fits. You follow me? Because if you have a piece of data that's hanging out there that doesn't fit the thread, you're not there yet. And this was one of those problems. But it was resolved when I consulted with a plant physiologist and soil scientist who told me that there's a symbiotic relationship between a fungus in the ground and an acid formed by the root of the tree that will leach out elements and nutrients from soil and rock as food for the tree. But the active part of the root is the leading edge. And as the tree grows, the root system expands, that leading edge moves on, and that process stops. Bingo. That explained this apparent discrepancy, and everything fit. It was interesting, too, that there were actually some drawings that were made by these first-hand witnesses, and what we see on the stone is what we see in these drawings. And what I see as an investigator is consistency. It has to be consistent and it has to fit. Another interesting thing I noticed right away was that on the split side of the stone where the last 3 lines of the inscription are, there were some interesting impact marks along the edges of that surface. Somebody had bushwhacked or hammered the edge of that stone and split it down to the shape that it now is, from a much larger stone. Now, you have to understand geologically, this is a glacial erratic boulder. It's a flat, tabular-shaped slab that was much larger at one time. But it's very important that we documented that because I maintain, and I hope you will buy into, the whole point that that split side face that you see with those last 3 lines has a different color, texture, and weathering profile than the rest of the stone, which is glacial in age and has been weathering for about 10 to 12,000 years. I maintain it was made at the same time that the inscription was carved, because you can't carve on that surface until you create it, right? You with me? Robert, are we okay? Okay. All right. Another interesting thing I'll never forget when I first saw the stone was that I looked at the inscription and the characters looked white. They were just made. And in fact, I read many accounts, early accounts, about how they said, oh, it looks like it was just scratched out with a diamond tool and it was freshly made. And I know that this created confusion and bias because you can just hear it in the words that people wrote. And it confused me at first until I got it under the microscope and I looked closely. And I could see that the bottom of the grooves were fresh because somebody had scratched them out. But the walls of the grooves were weathered, and you can clearly see that in this photograph. Later on, I learned that Olaf Ullman, after the stone came back to his home in December, that first year, after all the work was done on the farm, they brought it back, being a curious and intelligent man, not formally educated, but an intelligent guy, took a nail and scratched out the entire inscription because many of the characters were still packed with mud. Again, now everything fit and made sense, and we can explain this apparent discrepancy. Well, in our business, to get to the bottom line, we need to do invasive testing. In geology, we need to cut rocks up, we need to make thin sections, we need to look at the minerals and do all kinds of testing, because before I could tell them anything about the weathering, I had to know exactly what the rock was. And to do that, I needed to take a core, and I did that. I took a 1-inch diameter core out of the back of the stone, much to many people's consternation, but you know how I convinced them to do it? I said, the world thinks this is a fake, right? Yeah, unfortunately. So you've got everything to gain and nothing to lose, right? Huh, yeah, go for it. So we did. That was amazing. And it was from this core sample that we did the relative age weathering studies. Now, there will be a quiz, so I want you to pay close attention. This rock is a Paleoproterozoic metagraywacke, about 2 billion years old. It's up in the Lake Superior region of rocks where I went to school and studied. And I actually did this work with one of my retired professors, one of the best sedimentologists in the world. His name is Dr. Richard Ojekangas. He's still with us. And there were people that told him at the time I did this work, you better not work on the Kensington Runestone because it'll ruin your reputation. I heard the same thing. But I'm the type of guy, you tell me to do something, not to do something, that's why I'll do it for sure. Anyway, I appreciate the fact that OJ said, that's fine, we'll just go ahead. So we did a point count. There's a lot of different minerals in this rock, 16 to be exact, and there were a lot of minerals for me to choose from to try to come up with some type of a weathering study to figure out how old this thing is. But one of the important points is that this rock is indigenous to Minnesota. They didn't bring it over from Scandinavia. They didn't bring it over from the East Coast. It's probably part of the Thompson Formation, which is a sequence of metamorphosed sediments that are in the southern or the western region of Lake Superior. I mapped those rocks when I was in college under Dick Ojekangas. So we knew which rock this was. Has a very unique foliation, two-directional foliation in it that's very unique and diagnostic. So the point of this is that whoever carved this stone didn't bring it from somewhere else. They came here, selected a rock, and carved it. I can't tell you how many times I've heard historians say, well, they couldn't have got there, it was too far. I go, hey, Gunner, they got here. So here's what we did. This is how we answered the question. I took that core sample, and where we snapped it off inside the bottom of the hole, that surface with no weathering, and the way that rock looked like after the glacier dropped it off and it scratched it all up, is that picture on the left. This is a scanning electron microscopic photo, magnified 500 times. And because this rock has a lot of micas in it, different kinds of micas, flat, platy, soft minerals. When you break this rock or scratch it, it's going to fail along the weakest minerals. So to have these micas on the surface was not a surprise. Then I looked at the top of the core, which has been weathering for about 10 to 12,000 years. And it started off looking like the picture on the left, and then the surface looked like the picture on the right because all the micas had weathered away, primarily through mechanical weathering processes, not chemical processes. Micas are fairly tough. That wasn't a surprise to me at all. But then what I did is I took a chip sample off the split side, which you have all agreed was made at the same time as the inscription, right? That meant I didn't have to take a sample from one of the runes and damage the inscription. And then I put it in the SEM, and when the image came up, I started laughing because intuitively I knew the answer to the question. All the micas were gone. Now, this doesn't put a number on it, but intuitively I knew that process to go from there to there, and you saw that that surface looks different than the glacial weathering surface. It's not as advanced, so it represents something in between. Now, the way that I was able to put a number on it is I went out to the East Coast. I just dreamed this up, and I went to a Revolutionary War era cemetery that had tombstones that were old enough. In Minnesota, ours only go back to the middle 1800s. That had this mica mineral in it, biotite, that was the same mineral grain size and a comparable weathering environment, because the criteria for the experiment has to be as close to the same as possible. And what I did was I took chip samples with permission off the surfaces of the carved tombstones, and I just went back in time until the biotite minerals on these slate tombstones began to come off the surface. Once the first one came off, experiment's over, because I can't go any farther. But that happened at about 200 years. And on the runestone inscription, they're all gone. So my conclusion was the weathering of the inscription is older than 200 years, and that's from 1898. So we're going back 200 years from there, which means it can't possibly be the late 19th century hoax that everybody said it was. And I said that. And I thought to myself, well, good for them. They got one. I'm done with this project. We can move on. And then I wrote my report. I gave a presentation at the Midwest Plains Archaeological Conference, and then the trouble started. Oh my God. I got blasted. And, oh, well, that's not right. That can't be. This is a hoax. I said, well, didn't you hear what I just said? No, it's not. And it just bounced right off their forehead. I couldn't believe it. And then it got nasty. And I mean nasty. And Robert, you know what I'm talking about. And what was funny was, and this, he knows what I'm talking about. There were no geologists that were complaining. They all went, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you're probably right. It was people in what I call soft science disciplines. Nothing wrong with them. They're all wonderful disciplines. I'm talking about history, language, runology, anthropology, archaeology. And these people were complaining to me, and I'm like, okay, well, I appreciate your opinion. What evidence do you have, or what point do you have that tells you that I'm not right? Well, I never heard any of that. And then when that sort of died down, you know what happened next? Then they started to come after me personally, because if they can't refute the evidence, then you attack the messenger, right? Right? Right. And it's never stopped. Oh my gosh, when we started doing America Unearthed, oh geez, just Google my name. I never knew these things about me. Janet, wasn't that an interesting experience? Well, all I can say is that I went to school on a football scholarship. I played 4 years of college football, I played 4 years of minor league football, and I was a linebacker. So if people want to go, let's go. So it's been on for 16 years, and it's not going to stop, I can promise you that. One of the things that was interesting, and I put this in for Robert, is that after I opened my mouth and said it was real, I then found out that the first state geologist of Minnesota, Professor Newton H. Winchell, who is a giant in our field. I'll tell you how smart this guy was. He was the scientist that traveled with General George Custer into the Black Hills, and he was the first geologist to map the Black Hills and document that there were gold deposits there. But the last trip that Winchell took with Custer was the one before the Little Bighorn. That's how smart he was. And that's a true story, too. So this guy, the University of Minnesota Geology Department is called Winchell Hall, okay? I knew who this guy was. He's like the man. And then I heard that he studied the Kensington Runestone, and I went, oh my God. Different conclusion. My life is over. Seriously. So I buckled up and I started to dig in. I went to the Minnesota Historical Society. I spent 6 months researching him. I can tell you anything about him you want to know, his family, his work. He's incredible. He was even more amazing than I already knew. He took 3 trips to Kensington. He sat down and interviewed Olaf Ullman, his kids, his relatives, his neighbors. He talked to people that didn't believe the runestone was real, people that didn't like Olaf because of the attention that he got, that he didn't particularly care for. And he took a chip sample off the stone and he made a thin section, he identified the rock, and he did a relative age weathering study. The same stuff that I did. And I didn't know any of this. And I'm reading this and I'm like, what did you conclude? And this is what he concluded. And he wrote in this letter, the said stone is not a modern forgery and must be accepted as a genuine record of exploration in Minnesota at the date stated in the inscription. Now, is that sort of a tentative conclusion, as some people claim? BS. He was emphatic. And you know what I did when I read this? I went, whew. But you know what? I shouldn't have been nervous, because all I did was replicate independently what he already did. And that's the way it works in science. So I'm sticking to my guns. It's real, it's important, and this artifact represents the beginning of the founding of this country. That's a big statement, isn't it? It's true. You'll see. So, if there's a magic bullet runologically, it's that dot down in the lower right. In medieval times, the language was coalescing. And to indicate changes in the way certain sounds were pronounced, they would modify the rune or the letter to indicate a change in the way something was said. Now, this bone was found in 1935, and it's actually a little poem that some guy was probably romancing some woman down in southern Sweden back in medieval times. And you can see there's 2 dots in that R to indicate something called a palatal R sound, or what we call the dotted R. Ironically, that same year, they found a grave slab in Ukna parish in southern Sweden, and they found 2 more dotted R's on this grave slab that had never been seen before in the same year. In 1938, it was published, and for the first time in history, modern history, the world knew about the dotted R. Well, while I was doing my microscopic examination of the entire inscription, I documented a dot in an R in the word "we were fishing," vivar fisca, var, right there. And it's correct. It's a palatal R for that time period. Which begs the question, if the dotted R wasn't known by modern scholars until 1935, how did it get on the Kensington Runestone in 1898? Boom. Mic drop. Done. That dot right there, believe it or not, proves the Kensington Runestone is a medieval artifact all by itself runologically. Now, why don't the scholars talk about this? Why are they trying to erase it from the stone, which is happening right now? Why is that? Exactly. Guess what? They're not going to erase a dot on a rock. I can promise you that. So after this wave of criticism came and I said, it's on, one of the things I did was I took 5 trips to Sweden. The reason I took those trips is because logic, which is a beautiful thing when people use it, told me that if this stone is real, it means a certain number of things must be so, right? Like somebody came here, right? Someone came here from some place for some reason. It means everything in this stone, if it's real, has to have an explanation. I don't want to hear any more Scandinavian scholars tell me, well, that never existed, so it's a fake. First of all, that's flawed logic, okay? And the geology told me it's real, so it has to exist. That's why I took 5 trips, and guess what? Found everything. So you'd think they would be excited. Well, all I did was piss them off. Because I got out of my chair and went and looked for something I knew was there. I didn't know if I'd find it. But you know, it's amazing. When you go someplace, this happens to me a lot. And Graham, I want to point you out because in reading your latest book, you got out of your chair and you went there. And I guarantee you that before you went, you had a certain idea of things that you were hoping to find. And I know at least a few times you found way more than you could have imagined. And that happened to me. So it's all been found, okay? So let's just stop with those silly arguments. The bulk of the evidence that we found, almost all of it, was on this island that's in the middle of the Baltic Sea. It's called Gotland. It's where all the Swedes and people in the Baltic region go for their vacations. It's beautiful. There are 99 churches on this island. I've been to every one of them because I'm anal retentive. I work in a lab, okay? And one of the things that we know for sure in medieval times is that the only person capable of carving an inscription of this complexity and length had to be a member of the clergy, right? Why? Because the common people weren't educated by design. So, what clergy do we have on the island where I found all the runic dialect, grammar, and runic features? The Cistercians. They were the only ones there. I have no other candidates. Remember, I'm following the evidence trail. And this was the simplest investigation I've ever done. Well, how many people have ever heard of the Cistercians? The white monks. How many people have heard of the Knights Templar? How many people know that the Knights Templar are Cistercians? Yeah. Yeah. And the charismatic leader of the Cistercians is a guy named Bernard de Clairvaux, who joined the order with 30 family members in 1113. At Citeaux, he formed the first daughter abbey of Citeaux at Clairvaux. And I can tell you this, in my opinion, that guy right there is arguably the most important historical figure in the history of the world, especially our world today, and nobody knows who he is. It's incredible. I could talk for hours about him. Cistercian? You know what a cistern is? Yeah. They practice ritual bathing, and it has to do with, this was one of the most sacred things they used to do. They would wash their heads, hands, and feet before and after every meal. This whole idea of ritual cleansing and purity was very sacred to them. And I think somebody's going to talk about the Essene later. We might hear something about that, but I don't want to go into that too far. Anyway, it was Bernard who in 1128 wrote the charter for the Knights Templar order. And a papal bull was passed at the Council of Troyes in January of 1129, and the Templars became an official order. Notice how he's wearing a white tunic? Just like the Cistercians, they wore white tunics for purity and black mantles for dualism, I'll talk about in a little bit. Of course, the Templars were the ones that carried the sword. They were the military branch, and the true history behind the Templars and Cistercians is just amazing. I don't have time to go into it, but just know this, that when those 30 family members, including 2 of Bernard's uncles, who were part of those original 9 knights that went into the Holy Land prior to this time and dug under the Temple Mount and found stuff, 2 of those guys were his uncles. This was a coup d'etat, the greatest coup d'etat in history that nobody knows about. That's what this really was. But I'll come back to that a little later. As I was doing my research, I had to stretch myself intellectually, because as a geologist, I didn't really care about history that much. Now I love it. I can't get enough of it. But as I was researching the Cistercians and the Templars, trying to understand what they were really all about, I came to the conclusion quickly they were not the good Christians, Roman Christians that everybody thinks. Far from it. The leadership embraced a different ideology, completely different. And they cleverly, brilliantly, subversively aligned with their enemy, ideological enemy, with the ultimate goal of taking it over and turning things around. What do I mean by that? You guys have heard keep your friends close, your enemies closer? That's what this is about. Now, if you look at the symbolism and you read some of the words that people like Bernard wrote, you detect that things aren't exactly what they thought. Now, I think we can all be adults in the room here and talk about the fact that the Roman Catholic Church tipped things out of balance, right? It became a patriarchal faith. Men were up here, women were down here. Fact. What these guys did brilliantly was to try to reestablish the ancient faith that they embraced that goes back thousands of years, called monotheistic dualism. And dualism is that concept of opposites that keep things in balance. Male, female, heaven and earth, good, bad, light, dark, yin, yang. You guys know what I'm talking about. And by emphasizing the feminine was their way to tip things back into balance. Look at this 14th century parchment. Do you see how the Virgin, the goddess, is protecting the nuns and the monks equally? Another thing that they did is after the knights came back from the Holy Land in 1118, that's 10 years before they were an official order. Interesting. They started building these amazing Gothic cathedrals that incorporate sacred feminine architecture. Do you guys understand what I mean by that? It incorporates aspects of mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. And what you're really looking at here are goddess Venus temples. And they're designed after the sacred feminine, literally. I mean, what you're looking at here on the west end of Notre Dame, in this case, the 2 towers symbolize the knees of a woman in the birthing position, and the allegorical birth canal you can see in the middle. And the nave of the church is the womb. And when you go into these churches, you are being nurtured by the soothing words of the clergy, and then afterwards you are allegorically born back out into the world. But another incredible, through the allegorical birth canal, I think you guys can track that. The other thing that's really interesting about them is this whole concept of dualism, and as above, so below. That concept is beautifully illustrated in this way. You see the rose window, which is a symbol of the feminine. This is the Venus temple, the feminine temple. And the sun, in most ancient religions, is considered a male deity. And this all goes back to the whole concept of the original dualism, which is Venus, the physical manifestation of the goddess in the heavens, and the sun, who are the eternal travelers in the heavens forever. She rises when she's a morning star, the sun follows, they move across the sky, and when she's an evening star, the sun sets first and she follows. The eternal travelers in the esoteric religions. So, when the sun rises, or sets in this case because it's facing west, the rays of the sun enter the rose window, penetrate into the nave, and you have this allegorical fertilization or union of male, female, heaven and earth, good, bad, light, dark, dualism. Now, this is not about sex, folks. This is about life. So, my education was really getting interesting. And when you look at the nave, it has a very important ratio, roughly 2 to 1. I find it interesting the runestone was split down to that same shape, approximately. I don't think that's a coincidence. The last thing that I was unable to figure out, and it took the Freemasons to help me, because all this research into the Cistercian and the Templars also dovetailed with Freemasonry. And I remember giving a talk, and I explained this whole concept of the X. And if you chop it in half horizontally, you have the V, the vessel, the chalice, the womb, the symbol for the female. Inverted 180 degrees, you have the sword, the phallic, the penis, the symbol for the male. When you combine them in an X, you have the allegorical union of male, female, heaven and earth, good, bad, dualism, right? But then I looked at the Freemasons and asked them, and now I ask you, what's the hook? You bet it is. But what does it mean? One person raised their hand and said, a child? And I went, oh my God. And I looked at Janet and she whispered to me, she mouthed to me, Sarah, the daughter. And if you look, that's a little V, right? Yes. A little girl inside the womb of her mother. And maybe that's Daddy down below. What's the Holy Trinity? Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? What's the Holy Spirit? It isn't well defined, is it? Well, here's what I think. You got the Father, you got the child. Who's missing? Hello? Maybe that's the Holy Trinity. Some people have suggested that that represents Mary Magdalene, their daughter Sarah, still in the womb at the time of the crucifixion, and Jesus. I'm just saying. That's what some people say. And if these are the Templars, that would make a lot of sense. So I got all excited, and I called a friend of mine who's a very high-ranking Freemason in Canada, Bill Mann, and I said, Bill, you won't believe it, the child, the hook, and the whole thing. And I went through, he said, but Scott, that's great. He said, but don't forget about the Egyptians. And the minute he said that, something clicked in my head. I said, Bill, I got to go. I'll call you back. And I just jumped in the car, drove down to Midway Book in St. Paul. I went to the Egyptian section, and within a minute, I found what I was looking for. Do you see it? It's the same thing. His father was Akhenaten, who I won't go into a lot right now, but this is just the beginning of how this whole story fits together in a thread that continues right up to this day. The eggs, or the crook carries the eggs of fertility. So, now we've got things pretty well under control, we think. One of the other things that happened is I remember when I got mad, they were yelling at me. I'm like, all right, get that stone back in here. Before these academics can say anything about what this inscription says, you have to know what's there. So they brought it back in, and I did a photo library. I took pictures, 650 photos under high angle and low angle reflected light to pull out the three-dimensionality of the characters on the stone. And I started to find things like strange dots that were added after the inscription was carved, and short strokes and a weird split on this thorn ruin that nobody had ever noticed before. Why is that? Because nobody ever looked, because it's a fake, right? I knew it wasn't a fake, and I had noticed these things, and I just put them in a separate folder. Subsequent to that, we did some research, and we think we have figured out a few things. These modifications are codes that are saying, pay attention to me, I'm important. One of the things we figured out is that stroke right there that goes across the line on both sides and right here, and this dot in the very first thing, I'll never forget, when I was looking at the scope, I go, what's that hole doing there? Is that really a hole? Yeah, that's a hole. Well, it's a code. It's a dating code using the medieval Easter table dating code practice that I saw all over Gotland when I was going around. I saw it on grave slabs, above doorways, carved or cast in bells. It was incredible. And this is what the medieval Easter table looks like. There's over 500 years represented on this table. And I won't go into the details, but basically you need three things. Back at that time, the runic alphabet had 19 characters. You need a Sunday letter, which is one of the first 7 letters, F-U, thorn, O-R-K, and so on. And then you need a golden year, which is any one of the next 12 runes. And you need a column number. Now, this is what the actual table looks like. This is a modern one that we just converted to letters and numbers so we can follow along. And when you plot these three things, the U is the second letter, perfect for a Sunday letter. The L is the 12th rune, that works as a golden year. And 8 is a column number. And when you plot those on this table, you get a year. Anybody care to guess? Very good. Cheater. 1362. Well, wait a minute. We've already got that date carved on the stone in pentatic numbers and Arabic placement. Why did they code it again within the inscription? Maybe because it's a land claim. Acquisition, journey, or taking up land. What's the most important thing on a land claim? The date. We were here first. But somebody, if they wanted to, could take a chisel and carve another bar on the 3 in 1362 and add 100 years. Can't do that because we protected the date from alteration using a simple code, just like your PIN number on your credit card, to protect it from alteration. Brilliant, right? Well, why would they come to Minnesota? That doesn't make any sense. You know how many times I've heard that? You know what I say back to them? Well, I can guarantee you this, if everything that is true, they did it for a reason. And it had to be a compelling reason. Well, the land claim works. And did you know, but why Kensington? Why there? Well, see that dark line where that red dot is? That is the north-south continental divide running through our part of the country. That little knob in Minnesota on the western edge, that's where the divide goes right through there. The rivers run north to Hudson Bay at that divide, and then south down to the Gulf of Mexico. And did you know in the 14th century, both the French and the Dutch had a land claim practice where if you could prove you navigated to the headwaters of a river system, you could lay claim to the entire river system and all the land associated with it. So at Kensington, dopey Kensington, these guys could have theoretically laid claim to the Red River, Hudson Bay watershed to the north and the Minnesota, Missouri, Mississippi watershed to the Gulf, which is about half the continent. Boom again. Why am I the first person to figure this out? This has been around for 118 years. And I got to tell you, I'm a nice boy and all that, but there's no magic here. I'm not some brilliant scholar. I'm not. This is logic. This is basic stuff. Why don't people know about this? I guarantee you these academics aren't this dumb. Well, if you're going to place a land claim, aren't you going to have to be able to come back and find it? Well, logic demands they had to have a method. Curiously, at the Oman farm, there's a bunch of these strange, rounded, triangular holes that vary from 1.5 inches to 6 inches deep that can only be made with a straight chisel and a hammer. And what we did is we asked a surveyor to plot these strange stones with holes in them at the Oman farm. This is a satellite view. All those red dots are the stone holes. And then Janet and I printed up a bunch of copies, and we started connecting lines. Now, the first thing we have to do, though, is put that stone back in its original position because it was moved in 1985 when they upgraded the Oman farm into a park. But we have photos from the 1940s. We know exactly what its original position was. And here's what happened. Do you remember that picture of Olaf where he was standing? Right there. That's exactly where the runestone was found. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. What are those other red dots, Scott? Well, being a good scientist, you can't ignore data that you don't like. Right, Robert? What I can tell you is that those 4 dots that are in the edge of the field, those are the smallest boulders that have stone holes in them. We think the Omans moved them into the ditch when they were farming. So those are out of play. The 3 that are in the north are big boulders, and they have not been moved. And the family that owned that property back in Olaf's time and sold it to the Symbolic said, we've been plowing around those things for years. What's interesting is when you connect the three, you make a perfect equilateral triangle. The most important symbol in Freemasonry, I can tell you that, and in Templarism. And I think it's just a coded, it's a symbol of deity. And I think it's a symbol that told a returning party, it's us. That's my thesis. So, fact, the first 4 letters in the inscription as you read it that are singled out by the carver with dots or short strokes, half strokes, not full strokes across both sides of the line, are G-R-A-L. In medieval Old Swedish, that spells grail. That grail. It's interesting, it was the Cistercians who wrote many of the Grail legends. Again, as an investigator, you can apply the same scientific investigation techniques in history, in runology, in anything you want. It's a process, and everything fits. Now, is that what the carver intended? I'll let you decide. I don't know for sure, but isn't that interesting? So, the ritual code, here's the new discovery. I won't ask if there's any other brothers in the room to single them out, but I will tell you this, that a lot of what I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to give away the big secrets, but I'm going to tell you some things that we don't normally talk about. Now, when you become a Freemason, you go through what they call the Blue Lodge, which is that blue circle with the compass and square down below. And there's 3 degrees: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. And then after that, you are a full-fledged brother. You're in. You're on the squad. But if you want to pursue additional light or knowledge, you can go through a couple of different branches. One is called the Scottish Rite, which I don't have illustrated here. But there's a total of 32 degrees with an honorary 33rd that is bestowed on somebody, and you can't strive for that. It has to be given to you. It's honorary. There's also something called the York Rite, which is illustrated here, which is basically made up of 3 parts. We have what we call the Royal Arch, which is the red one with the triple tau. We have the cryptic degrees, and then we have what I call the Templar degrees. There's a total of 13 degrees. 13, that number, by the way, is the number of the sacred feminine. Just remember that. So it was, and I've been through both of these. I'm a 32nd degree Scottish Rite, and I'm a Knights Templar. And so when I was going through the degrees, something happened when I was going through the cryptic degrees, specifically something called the Select Master degree. Now, in the Select Master degree, basically, the Masonic degrees are broken up into part theatrical performance and part lecture by what I call the White Hats. Those are the 33rds. And in this particular degree, we're talking about the time period right at the end, at the completion of the first temple in Jerusalem. And what we learn about is what's in the ark and what's on the ark, and it's cool. And we learn that the 3 grand masters, Hiram Abiff, Hiram king of Tyre, and King Solomon, decide they want to build a secret vault below the Sanctum Sanctorum inside the temple and hide a copy of all the treasures. And so the 3 grand masters built the secret vault. Then later in the lecture, one of the White Hats was getting up there and he said, and the other 8 arches were built by 22 men from Gebel in Lebanon. And I went, 8 and 22? And I didn't hear anything after that. Those are the first 2 numbers on the Kensington Runestone. And I'm like, holy crap. So I went to my Masonic mentor, John Freeberg, and I said, John, is there a ritual book for this? He said, yeah. I go, give me that. So I started going through it, and lo and behold, it kept going. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail because we're getting into stuff that I really shouldn't be talking about. But they're okay with me talking about the numbers. The numbers keep appearing in sequence. This is like winning the lottery. Too many numbers in the same sequence, after a while, it's not a coincidence anymore. And you can see how they fit. And trust me, in the ritual, they fit. One of the other things that's interesting when I started to look at this and look at the runestone in a different way, one of the passages in the ritual book says, and the secret work was, their hours of labor were performed from 9 at night until midnight, when all prying eyes were closed in sleep. Well, 9 plus how many makes 12? 9 lines of text on the face plus 3 on the side for a total of 12. Maybe that's a coincidence. Then I started to dig even deeper into the Kabbalah tree of life, which is something that we learn some very basic rudimentary stuff about in the Scottish Rite degrees. And I found it interesting that the tree of life is comprised of 10 spheres that create 22 paths that rest on 3 pillars for a total of 32 emanations, with a possible 33rd hidden emanation with the 11th sphere that would fit in that upper space that you see in the middle. I don't think I have to tell you that this is the basis for the Scottish Rite degrees. The KRS, if you add the numbers up, it's interesting. You get 8 plus 22 is 30, plus 2, Ashishar and Adoniram, is 32, plus Zerubbabel is 33. Is that another coincidence? I don't think so. One of the interesting things that I noticed, I'll never forget, one day I counted up all the hooked X's. Guess how many there are? 22. It's a confirmation code. And in the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, it says God saw appears 7 times. God said appears 10 times. God's name appears 22 more times. And the name Elohim occurs 32 times. Hebrew scholars say these are confirmation codes. We have confirmation codes on the runestone. 22 hooked X's, 14 individual numbers, 10 W runes that have never been seen before in a runic inscription, and these strange G runes, there's 7 of them. Could this be more coincidences? I don't think so. The first thing in the inscription is the number 8. What's so special about the number 8? Why did they begin with 8? Because 8 is the number of deity in Hebrew mysticism. Yes, if you turn it sideways, you get infinity. But why is it the number of deity? Why did they make the Newport Tower and the altars in their sacred structures octagonal with 8 columns? Why does the Templar cross have 8 points? Because it's acknowledging deity. Why? I'll tell you. Now, this is in St. Paul's Chapel, which you can read about in my wife's book. There's some amazing things there. And at the top of that beautiful glory, you see the Hebrew letters Yod-He, Vav-He, which is the immutable name of Creator, which goes way back. Oftentimes you'll see it inside of a delta, a triangle. And there's a concept in Hebrew mysticism and in the Kabbalah called gematria. You also see it. There's Greek gematria. There's other forms of gematria. Gematria is the science of numbers. There's a specific part of gematria called numerology reduction. I'm going to teach you it right now. And basically what you do is you assign a numeric value to every letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which you see illustrated here in these amazing documents that were found in Iceland and published last fall, that were hidden away from the world because the Roman Church tried to cleanse Iceland of all of this runic and Hebrew magic that was the devil's work. And they basically told everybody in Iceland in the 1590s, we're coming, you better turn over all that stuff because we're going to go through your houses, and if we find this stuff, we're going to burn you. Look it up. Well, there's all kinds of this stuff. A lot of people said the heck with you, and they kept it. So, Here's that tetragrammaton with the mutable word of the Creator inside the delta. The way numerology reduction works is you take all the letters in a particular word, you assign the values, and you add them up, and you get a total. If that total is more than one number, then you split the number and you add it until you reduce down to a single digit. The name of deity in the tetragrammaton is 8. Interesting, if you do the same with Jesus, his name wasn't Jesus, it was Yeshua. You also get 8. This is why 8 is the number of deity. This is why in most churches you will see octagonal architecture, usually in the steeple, calling down deity to us or us trying to get up to deity. The number 10, there's all kinds of possibilities why 10 is important. The 10 Commandments, the 10 spheres, referring to the secret vault. Remember, there were copies, so there were 2 sets. So when the temple was being ravaged and Babylonians were carrying away the treasures, guess what? The good stuff was still down below. Ah! I love that. I love it. 10 in Hebrew mysticism and in Freemasonry is the number of perfection. Why 14? What's so special about 14 days' journey? 14 is the number associated with resurrection. Did you guys know that? You know why? If you read the Isis-Osiris mysteries, you learn that Osiris goes off and is killed by his jealous brother Set, who cuts his body up into 14 pieces and places those parts along the Nile for the crocodiles to eat. And then his lover Isis goes looking for her lover, and she finds 13 pieces, everything except his phallic, which she then creates one either out of gold or beeswax. She impregnates herself. Horus is born. He grows up to be Osiris, and the whole cycle starts over again. And all it is an allegorical story about life on the planet. Birth in the spring, death in the fall, resurrection on the winter solstice. We also have the resurrection story in the number 14 played out in every Catholic church around the world in the Stations of the Cross. There are 14. And this is the story of resurrection, right? We also have it in Freemasonry. When we are raised as a brother, we become Hiram Abiff, who was buried outside the temple in the mountains for 14 days. So, this resurrection thing. What's important to think about, and this is what I was trying to do, is before you can understand what people will do, you have to understand how their minds work. And that's what all this was about, was trying to figure out, okay, what do they think? What do they believe? Does it fit with what we're finding? This is the Newport Tower in Rhode Island. It's been there for over 350 years. They said it was built as a windmill, which is nonsense. A structural engineer will tell you it would be torn apart by the forces created by wind on those sails. This was built by the Templars. 8 columns, evenly spaced. You could take a Templar cross, put it inside the middle of it, and every point will touch the columns. But here's something we discovered in 2007. And again, the architecture was brought back from the Temple Mount. This is on the Temple Mount. I was there last year. And this octagonal architecture is all over the Temple Mount, including octagonal structures with Romanesque columns, 2 stories, just like you see at the Newport Tower and in other structures built by the Templars, mostly churches or chapels. Now, on the winter solstice, and this is very personal to me because my birthday is December 21st. I'm a solstice baby, or as Janet likes to say, the shortest, darkest day of the year. What do you mean by that, honey? Anyway, on the winter solstice, When the sun rises and comes into the south window, it creates a light box. And at 8:15 on December 21st of 2007, we had figured something out based on some pictures that somebody took and didn't understand what he was looking at. And I'll never forget, I was at this lecture just like this, and I went, oh my God, I know what that is, I know what that is. And everybody said, shut up. And so I took a trip out to Newport, and I said, this is what is going on. And this happens, what you're about to see happens at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, which is a very important time of medieval monastic prayer. Do you see that egg-shaped keystone? Boom again. This was an epiphany moment for me. And the funny part was, I was supposed to be there with another guy, but he just went off running. So this happened all by myself. And it was a moment when I knew that all this crap I had been telling you about is right. So I want you to look at that egg again. Do you notice how it's not centered in the archway? No self-respecting medieval stonemason would do that, would they? What does logic tell you? They did it for a reason. I also discovered on the backside of that egg, exactly back to back, that little stone you see on the outside is the bottom of another keystone, the only other true keystone in the tower. And you see the round red granite orb above it? Does that look like the symbol for Royal Arch Masonry? Exactly. And if you look close, you can see we have the notch keystone, which was the Mark Master Mason, the Master Mason's honor to put in the final keystone inside of a structure. And he would notch the top of the stone. That was his mark. But again, it's not centered exactly in the archway because it's back to back with the egg, the only two keystones in the tower. And I'll never forget, I was looking up at that keystone on the outside, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, what are you pointing to? This is what happened to me. I start talking to these rocks. Robert, you've done it too. I know you have. Anyway, I was standing there looking at the keystone, and I turned to the west, and I looked into space, and it hit me just like that. So if you draw a line from the center of the Newport Tower through those two keystones into space, guess where it goes? It goes to Kensington. Now, you're probably saying, oh, come on. This is 7 years ago. It's going to be 2017. It's going to be a decade. Do you think if all the haters could prove me wrong, that they wouldn't have done it by now? Oh my God, they would have. Silence. So what does this do? What does this mean? It means they're connected, obviously. I've said the Templars carved it. I've said the Templars carved the tower, and it's connected. So think like a Mason now. Think like somebody who's been initiated. In the rituals, some of what we have is real. Some of it's not. It's allegory. The difficult part is figuring out what's real and what's not. And so in the Royal Arch, allegorically, the keystone of North America is the Kensington Runestone. It's in the geographic center. Why? Because it represents the allegorical Royal Arch that holds the sanctuary for the Knights Templar and the monotheists who were under persecution in 1307, not 50 years before this was placed. This was their sanctuary. And the runestone was the first foot in the ground to to lay claim, and then they brought the stuff over, which is a whole nother story for another day. So if I'm right about that, and this whole idea that some of the message is real and some of the runestone message is allegory, what's real and what's not? Well, I think the land claim part is real. And I also think the runestone could be telling us where the secret vault is. What are you talking about, Scott? I'm talking about a secret vault here in North America the Templars put stuff in. One day's journey could possibly be 1 degree north, and 14 days could be 14 degrees. Now remember, if this is true, this doesn't tell us where the secret vault is. I'll answer that in a second. So what's the elephant in the room about the pre-Columbian history of this country? How about Native Americans? If there was anybody coming on this continent prior to Chris, you know that guy that didn't set foot on this continent that already had millions of people living here? They would have run into the natives, right? The natives wouldn't let you set foot on here unless you came to an agreement. You have to have a wampum, right? A pass. Well, why don't we know about the natives? Well, for one thing, when the Smithsonian dug in their mounds, being funded by who? The Roman Church. They were looking for gold, because they like gold. And they were cleansing all the mounds to get rid of anything that was going to be a problem that would upset that little thing we called manifest destiny, that had 2 parts. One was the natives are savages, right? Isn't that what people do when you want to justify persecution? You label them. My God, we've been going through it for the last year and a half. Right? And that justifies persecuting them, or in the case of the natives, the word is genocide. So the natives don't really care what white people think. The other part of that is the myth of Columbus. There was nobody here before Chris, so it's our sovereign right to take this land. And that was the policy, and we all know it. So what we did, I thought about this a long time ago, and I was nervous about approaching the natives because I know what they'd been through, and I thought they'd tell me to. But here's an amazing thing. If you treat people with respect and honor their culture, and listen, and treat them like you want to be treated, it's amazing what happens. And Janet and I have done that with many native cultures, and they've embraced us because they know that we're just trying to get to the truth. And I can tell you this, they know. Oh my God, do they know. So anyway, Bill, man, I was telling you about, he's half native. He's also, did you guys know the natives have their own secret society? That's just like Freemasonry. In fact, it's exactly like Freemasonry. And they call the Templars their blood brothers. Now, Bill's standing in the middle there. That's his York Rite garb, which I've been in that same garb. And those are his native friends. 2 of those are shamans. And one of those is Mark Phillips, who I asked if he would allow me to participate in a midday sweat. And we did. And it was amazing. But throughout this research that I talk about in my latest book, one of the things that is absolutely a fact, and by the way, I have no idea how much time I have left, so when I'm getting close, just let me know. You're fine. Okay, all right. They have the same rituals as Freemasons and Templars. They're not similar, they are the same. The Smithsonian documented that the first missionaries and fur traders that came over here said the natives were doing these rituals when we got here. So as an investigator, what it tells me is either these same rituals developed on 2 different continents independently, not likely, or there was contact. Occam's razor, right? The Algonquin prophecies say it's time to share what they know. I don't have time to tell you what that means other than to say, does anybody know what precession of the equinoxes is? It has to do with that. And they keep track. This was the day we did the sweat. You sit around the campfire and they heat the stones up. And you talk for hours. And you get to know each other. And the whole time, they're vetting you. And sweat may not happen. Fortunately for us, it did. And what you're doing is, you see that little bear den there on the left? You're going back into the womb of the Great Mother, where it's warm, it's wet, it's dark. And you go back to being a baby in the womb, and it's amazing. And what he did was, he told us an abbreviated version of the creation story. And what was great about it is that it started with rocks. Then he did a little healing. Then he went around the room, and everybody had a chance to say something. And I apologized to the natives for the way our people treated them. And then he said, okay, Scott, ask your questions. And so he did, or I did, and he answered my questions. Anyway, guess how many stones were in the 9 stones, 9 levels. And he said, this was just a easy sweat. I said, what's the most you've ever done? He said, 40. I'm like, oh my God. Chief Black Eagle of the Wampanoag tribe, they're the people that were in the territory where the Newport Tower was built. Last summer, not this summer, a year ago, on camera, I said, so Daryl, that's his white name, who built the Newport Tower? He said, Prince Henry and his people when they came through here. I said, no way. He said, well, yeah. And then I said, what happened when the white people came here? I mean, what did you guys do when the white people came here? Swear to God, he said this. We beat the shit out of them. I said, you did? Why? He said, the ones that survived, we took them in. The ones that didn't, we buried them in the woods. He said, those Celtic people were tough people. That's what he said. I recorded it. We got it. So, if you haven't figured it out, there's no way that the Templars could have operated on this continent without aligning, literally sharing their blood, their rituals with the natives. That's the only way you're going to make it here. So if the Templars brought stuff over and put it in a secret vault that, according to the natives, is in Montana, maybe the Templars evolved into modern Freemasons, and word of the vault got to some of the Masons, our founding fathers. Like this guy that many people don't think was a Freemason, but if you look on that list, you'll see his name on the roll of the Lodge of Nine Sisters in France when he was the ambassador to France for 5 years. What I think, and this is my speculation, is somebody whispered in his ear about the secret vault, because he made a purchase, right? We call it the Louisiana Purchase. He bought it from Napoleon, who was a brother from France. Templars were founded in France. Anyway, Meriwether Lewis was a brother and had secret communication, a coded Masonic communication, a cipher that only he and Thomas Jefferson used. And he, on the core of exploration, they went immediately to Montana. Now, William Clark at this time was not a Freemason. So Lewis separated from Clark for 6 weeks. And the first thing he did is he went up the Little Blackfoot River and he crossed the divide. According to Bill and other natives, he was within a day's ride of the secret vault. But, you remember Sacagawea? Yes. Her brother was Kamehameha, chief of the Shoshone, the horse people. He introduced Lewis to the chief of the Blackfoot. According to the natives, the guardians of the vault are the Blackfoot. Why did he want to meet with the chief? So if that's true, oh, by the way, he separated with 9 men, They don't do this stuff by accident. So if this is true, they probably recovered it, and it's probably in Washington. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Now, this is the last bit, but I have to say something before I tell you. What I'm about to say is very controversial stuff. And for people of a certain religious persuasion, this will be offensive. And I just want to say that I'm not here to try to offend anybody. I'm trying to get to the truth. I'm going to present facts and my interpretation of those facts. So I'm not here to offend. So if anybody gets offended from here on, it's your own fault. Are we good? Okay. I just gave you the religion speech. How many people have heard of the Talpiot tomb? Ooh, you're going to like this. In 1980, in southern Jerusalem, 2 miles from the walled city in the East Talpiot neighborhood, there was construction going on. They were blasting in the hillsides in preparation for building apartments. And they blasted and discovered a first century tomb. This is not unusual in Jerusalem. These things are out there. They don't know where they are, but they all date back to the first century, where a particular group of people called the Essene would bury their dead. And that's the entrance to this particular tomb. Notice the chevron circle. I'll talk about that tomorrow. And this is the diagram of the footprint of what's inside that entrance. You see it's roughly a square area that has tunnels called kokims going off. And you see those boxes right there? Those are called ossuaries. Now, back in the first century, and again, this only went to about 70 AD when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. This practice was over. So we know exactly when they date to. But this particular group of Jewish people, Hebrews, not Orthodox Jews, a different group, only the family could process the body of the deceased. And what they would do is bring them into the antechamber, the front room, which you can see was destroyed, but it is open to the south, to the world. So that back wall, if we were in a big antechamber, would be open to the world, and the sun could come in. And what they would do is process the body with perfumes and oils. Then they would wrap it in a shroud, bring it inside the burial tomb, and if you look right there, you see those two benches between the tunnels. This is the one on the left. This is Simca Jacobovici, who is the guy that's done the pioneering work on this, a very brave guy, and we've worked with him. That's where they would place the body. They would leave it there for 1 to 2 years, and then they would come back and collect the bones and put them inside of a stone box called an ossuary. And these ossuaries were only big enough so that the bones fit inside crossed, and then the skull would go in last, and that's the origin of your skull and crossbones. It's a symbol of death to remind us all that life is short, and we need to make the most of it, right? But it's also a symbol of reverence for Jesus. Those pirates, Templar pirates, the Jolly Roger, maybe there was more going on than people thought. Then what they would do is, over time, they would fill up the family tomb with these ossuaries, and they would seal it with a stone. Now, this is a different tomb that curiously has a slanted top that looks an awful lot like the Kensington Runestone. I'm not saying there's a connection. I just find it very curious. In this particular tomb, there were 10 ossuaries, 7 inscribed with names, 6 in Aramaic, 1 in Greek. And these are the names. My favorite is number 4. Little boy running around, if you read carefully in the Bible. The last one is really interesting, and that's the ossuary there on the right with the flower of life carved on it. That one is the one that was carved in Greek. It says Mariamne the Mara. Mariamne is basically a pet name for only Mary Magdalene found in the Acts of Philip. The Mara is a title of honor, as in Lord, Master, or Queen. This is my interpretation. I read this. And I know that there have been about 3,000 to 4,000 ossuaries found in Jerusalem. There's only 6 that have the Mara on them. 3 are male. This is the 3rd one that's female. Those are the facts. So, wow. If you calculate the odds, which a friend of ours, Jerry Lutkin, has done, the odds of this not being the royal family are about 2 million to 1. And there's a lot of factors that go in here. You're going to read all kinds of stuff about the odds on the internet. Most of it is absolute BS. This is the one that says Jesus, son of Joseph, and what looks like scratches on there is actually very readable, very good 1st century Aramaic that says Jesus, son of Joseph, read right to left. One of the things that Simca and his other researchers were confused by was the X in front of Jesus' name. And so I contacted him. I said, I know what that is. That's the symbol of an initiate, somebody who's been educated in the ancient mysteries. And he went, wow, that's cool, because we've seen other ossuaries that have names of known clergy back at that time with X's on their ossuaries. Well, that's cool. So all of a sudden, I got street cred with these guys. One of the other things I pointed out to them was that if you read about the excavations in 1980, when the archaeologists went into the tomb, it was filled with terra rosa soil 2 feet deep, because somebody had entered the tomb in the historical past and didn't reseal it properly. And it allowed this soil to flow in. When they dug it out, they found 3 skulls at the bottom of the tomb, which were in good shape. The bones in the ossuaries were not. What I pointed out to the guys was these 3 skulls are in the east, west, and south quadrants of the tomb, which are where the 3 highest officers sit in a Masonic lodge and a Templar preceptory. Coincidence? The dating of the initial soil that went in was 900 years ago. What happened 900 years ago? Oh, the First Crusade. Who fought the First Crusade? Oh, Templars were part of that. Maybe they went in here. If so, why did they go in? They went in to their ancestral family tomb with reverence. And they probably left these 3 skulls, probably 3 knights who died during the initial siege of Jerusalem, and would have been honored to have their skulls placed inside the tomb as symbolic guardians of their ancestral king. That's my interpretation. I could be wrong, but I'm going with it. One of the other researchers, Charlie Pellegrino, who's a really smart guy, he went down on the Titanic with James Cameron. He contacted me through Simca and said, Scott, I'd like you to look at something. It's a symbol that's carved on the lid of the Jesus ossuary, and it's never been published. And he said, Simca and I and some of the other researchers thinks it's a star symbol. And he sent me these pictures 2 years ago, and when I opened them up, I almost fell over. What do you see? I'll tell you what I see. I don't see a symbol. I see a monogram of 2 symbols. The hooked X, which is a straight line version of the Hebrew Aleph, the first letter in the Aramaic alphabet, and the Tau, which is the last letter, which is Egyptian. This is basically a Tau, the Ankh. The Ankh is a Tau cross with an egg-shaped handle on it. Why is it a symbol of life and resurrection in Egyptian iconography? Because it's a nilometer. It goes back to ancient times. It was used to measure the height of the Nile in the spring, so they could predict if there was flooding, there'd be famine and death. If there was drought, there'd be death. And if it came in the middle, there'd be prosperity to the people. That's why it became that symbol that many of you are wearing around your necks. So if we have the first letter and the last letter represented, I told them maybe it's Alpha, Omega, beginning and end. on the lid of Jesus' ossuary. Boom. So, last slide. So, what about the other stuff that I told you is probably allegory? One of the things that always bothered me was we were fishing one day. Well, duh. Of course they were fishing every day to sustain themselves. Is that what it really means? Would a carver take the time to carve that? Probably not. You guys know what I'm talking about now. We were fishing one day. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're a follower of the fish, right? Pisces, the first king of the new age. Sacred geometry is involved. And if he's there, isn't she there too? AVM. Ave Virgo Maria Magdalena. And just for emphasis, they put a little dot in the lower right leg honoring her. And some people say it's not there, so I mapped it with digital 3D imaging. It's there. And so our land claim is made in the name of our ancestral king. The hooked X sits on Jesus' ossuary and in her name. And we are restoring balance, I hope. I'm done. Thank you.
How about a standing ovation? Wow, was this amazing? I had high expectations, but this was absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Scott Wolter.